Hey everyone, this is Pathmetrics. Welcome to episode 19 of Mixing Loud with Clip to Zero. In this video, I'm going to be expanding on the basic pattern I taught you about clipping from the top way back here in episode 6 of the series. I'm going to be explaining 4 advanced clipping concepts. We're going to talk about what it's like to clip very wide stereo tracks. This can be a little confusing to you until you've done it a few times or seen someone explain it to you. I'm going to talk about when you might want to actually set the threshold on your clipper, which in KClip is this little knob down here, when you might want to actually set that lower than 0. I mean, this is the clip to 0 method. So normally that threshold sits at 0, but there might be some cases where you actually want to crank that thing down below 0. And we're going to talk about that. I'm also going to describe the simple, easy way to do an A-B comparison of the clipping that's happening on a bus point, to help you hear how the different tracks that may themselves already be clipped are summing together on that bus point, and therefore they're getting clipped again by the bus clipper. And so, some of you may be wondering, how can I easily hear whether that clipping is too much? So we're going to talk about a simple trick for doing that. And then finally, I'm finally going to get into the subject of what is going on with these other things in my track CTZ rack that you've seen me using over and over. I've just been talking about KClip so far, but what's newfangled Saturate doing here? What's TrackLimit doing here? Some of you have been champing at the bit and asking the question, hey, wouldn't certain types of tracks sound better with a limiter instead of a clipper? And, when should I do that? Should I do that? Am I thinking about it the wrong way? And so, no, you're not thinking about it the wrong way. Sometimes we do replace KClip with something else, but the trick is to do it at the right point in the project and to do it the simple, easy way. So I'm finally going to talk about that and considerations for when and if you might find it better to replace KClip with something else. And in a reverse way, I'll also be talking about why we start with KClip and why starting with KClip is fine and actually much preferable to just starting out with something like Saturate or TrackLimit or something else instead, right from the early stages of the project. So the first 2 concepts here, I'm going to talk about together because it's easy to demonstrate both of these together. I got a question that kind of stimulated this. I'm just going to blow it up here, give you a chance to read it. But basically the idea is, it's someone who's been using the CTZ method and they're not trying to hit stupid, loudness target levels. They're working pretty quiet mixes down around -12 to -9 LUFS. And they weren't really clear about whether they meant integrated or max or whatever. But, the point is they have a quieter kind of genre that they're working in. They're not striving for really super competitively loud tracks. And so what they're noticing is that a lot of their individual track sounds aren't hitting the individual track clippers, when they're sitting at the right spot in the mix against the framework sounds. The peaks are going close to 0, but they're not going over 0. So those peaks on the individual more quiet tracks just aren't getting clipped at all. But there's still visible peaks, obviously like little caterpillar peaks. And then, by the time several tracks are summed together at some bus that they're a part of, some group that they're a part of, clipping is happening on those bus clippers. But this person's basic question was, if one of the ideas of clip to 0 is lots of little clips spread out everywhere is much better than one huge clip at the end or just a few big clips. Their question was, shouldn't I be doing something about those spiky peaks even in my tracks that aren't normally getting clipped by the track clippers? And they're only getting clipped downstream at a bus clipper, right? So let's talk about that because that's a good question. There is an answer. There's actually 2 answers depending on how much work you want to do. But it's perfectly easy and simple to do all this stuff. And let me show you how to do it. So let me do an artificial kind of example of this exact problem. You've been hearing this track for a while. It's one of the tracks I've been using to demo this. And so, that only real kind of mid-rangey sound you're hearing right now is this thing I'm just calling the roller. It's a rolling bass, right? And this is definitely getting clipped, and it's feeding into a bus called drops, where it's then feeding into a bus called midline, and so on all the way up the chain. Now, what if we add another sound in this same midline bus, right? What if I add a new sound that's like a chord sound happening in the background, kind of a bed, so it's not so sparse and dry? So I just made a quick and dirty little simple chord progression behind this that's going to sound like this now. All right, so we're going to look at this sound real close for a second. I'm going to solo it. We're going to hop in here and see what we did with all the clipping and stuff. So it's just a little doinky thing I made in Pigments real quick. We've got our track CTZ rack. An original sound is starting on this track. So we need to decide whether or not it needs to be clipped in order to be made loud enough to fit into the framework of this very loud kick, snare, and sub. Okay, this track's hitting around -6.5 LUFS. So can this raw piano sound coming out of Pigments loud enough? So one of the first things you do, of course, is you run dP meter and take a measurement on the peak, and then you click this little button here to automatically make the peaks from the sound hit 0 full scale. You normalize the source sound up to 0. So we're putting 8.2 dB of gain on it just to get it this loud. Okay, and then that was already loud enough to fit into the mix. I mean, it sounds pretty much roughly where it should be to not overwhelm everything else going on and sit a little bit in the background like it should, and it's nice and wide. So in this particular case, if we look at KClip, there's no need to actually clip it. Watch. So you mostly want to rely on this meter right here, but the threshold's at 0 and it's not getting clipped. So it's loud enough to fit into the mix. Why clip it? Okay, except, well, why clip it? That's a good question. Let's go look at a Scyscope Pro. Let's solo the piano and see what just the piano itself is looking like. So well, that's interesting, isn't it? Nothing looks like it's anywhere close to these lines at 0 dB full scale. This line here is 0. This line here is the bottom half of 0. We've got our threshold set at -0. We saw that dP meter said, hey, this thing's got peaks right up against 0. And, when I gain it up, we set it so that supposedly the peaks of this sound are touching 0. And yet, you're going to run into sounds sometimes where you look at this meter and go, wait a minute, why is dP meter telling me that it's hitting 0 or close to 0? Why is my DAWs meter here telling me that I'm just literally 1/10 of a dB under 0? These peaks in Scyscope don't look like they're anywhere near 0. What's going on, right? And you're going to be confused. This is the first time this happens to you. You're going to go, what? I thought, my oscilloscope was telling me what the waveform really looked like. So the first thing I need to explain is how oscilloscopes work, right? They can only show you mono information. So what they're doing under the covers is they're showing you either the left channel or the right channel, or if it's a really good oscilloscope, they'll have a mid-side matrix encoder inside, and they can also show you the mid signal, which is mono, and the side signal, which is also mono. Or if it's a really sophisticated clipper, they'll even show you a kind of stereo view of your left and right channels individually, or a kind of other stereo view of your mid and side channels. Most of the time, by default, it's going to show you the mids, the mono channel, when both the left and right are summed together. And when you sum the left and right together, it is only showing you the information that's identical in both the left and the right. And the stuff that's different in the left and right is left out of the waveform. And so what's happening is on either the left channel or the right channel, there are actually some peaks going way high closer to these zero lines, but you're not seeing it in this view because you chose to look at the mono view. And you're not necessarily going to see it on the side view either, because the side itself is only half of the total amount of energy, so to speak. Here we're looking at the side. Right? That's the difference, the stuff that isn't the same in both channels. But neither of these is the full story. The mid and the side are actually summed together to create the full signal, right? So what you have to say is when you look at something like this and you go, I don't understand, where's my peak that's supposedly getting close to zero? You should go, wait a minute. Listen to this sound. Listen how wide this sound is in my ears. Clearly, this is a very stereoized sound with a lot of width. And width means a lot of differences between the left and the right. So you need to just remind yourself, oh, either the left channel or the right channel has the high peaks. But because we're not seeing those differences, we're only seeing what's the same, we're not seeing those high peaks in this view. So what you do is you just say, let me look at the left channel first and see if those high peaks are on the left channel. So now we're just looking at the left. So we saw a couple peaks that got to about here on the left channel, but they weren't really close to the line. Let's go over and look at the right channel. And there you go. See that peak that's super close to zero? And then on the first couple hits, we also saw it. This is getting pretty close to zero too. So this is where those high peak values are coming from. You just can't see it when you're summed in to the mono, right? It just looks different. So this is a little gotcha. If you're ever scratching your head over this in the future, try to remember Baffy showed you this once. And, maybe think to check that signal. Another way, you can just kind of do them both in stereo and then maybe make your meter super big so you can kind of see it clearly and just run them side by side and look in both of these, because that's still the zero line here and here and here and here. Okay. And you see every time it runs through the pattern, the peaks are a little different because pigments is very highly modulated. There's a pretty tall one, right? See how this one is getting super close to zero down on the bottom? So once you understand that you have a sound that isn't hitting zero, but it's loud enough in the mix, but you can see that there are some pretty tall, skinny peaks in places, right? And you might say to yourself, okay, I'm being told it's always better to do lots of little clips than one big clip. And so even though this particular sound isn't clipping on its specific track, and in its first clipper that it hits, this instance of KClip right here, even though it's not clipping here and it may be getting summed higher up the stream with that rolling bass sound in the drops group, and they're getting summed together at the midline here, there's probably some clipping here at the midline. And the question is, should I go ahead and somehow force this track to clip a tiny bit to reduce these peaks from summing with whatever's happening in this, rolling bass line, and then that higher, bigger sum needing to get clipped at this bus? It's a bigger clip if I don't clip this on the first track that it starts out on, which is right here, okay? So that's a legitimate question, especially if, like this person, you have a lot of tracks that look kind of like this. None of the individual source tracks themselves are loud enough that their peaks are going above 0 and getting clipped by the clipper. But then that person wonders, wouldn't I still be getting a cleaner result if I did do just a tiny bit of shaving and cleanup on these peaks? And if so, how would I go about doing that? There's two ways to answer that. The first way is be lazy and don't worry about it too much. Don't overthink it. Just turned off the kick and snare ducker here, just otherwise it makes the sound too gappy, and I want you to be able to see and hear the clipping easily and not be annoyed by the slicing gap of the kick and snare ducker. We're going to look at the bus clipper on this track. So here's our bus clipper. And inside of it is my little rack with my 3 different possible clippers, which I will be talking about in this video finally in a bit. So let's look at the bus clipper and let's see if it's actually doing any clipping. So we're going to listen to the midline bus and just solo just the drop sound, the rolling bass, and that piano together and see if there's any clipping happening. Watch this value right here. Okay, so they clearly are summing, and the biggest clip that's happening is as much as 3.5 decibels of clipping. So this is that combined signal from both the rolling bass and the piano. Right, and here's one of those clips, obviously. You can totally see the clip happening here. So the whole point is we're clipping to the point where it's supposed to be transparent. But on buses, you don't have that control. Everything that's being clipped at a bus is kind of automatic. What we're saying with all these bus clippers is I've got a bunch of different tracks that are summing together at this bus, and there's clipping happening where those signals are all coming together. And you don't have any control. You don't set the clipper here. There's nothing to do. It's just that clipper exists to automatically catch everything that's going over 0, like a limiter. We want to hear how those tracks are interacting and whether or not that clipping is audible. And most importantly, if it is audible, does it sound bad? Or is it a very transparent amount of clipping? So this is where we get to the other trick I'm about to show you. Now I'm going to show you how to actually listen for whether there's a problem with the clipping on the bus. It's super easy to do. It's the easiest thing in the world to do. You want to hear what that clip sounds like, right? Does it sound bad? Do I notice it? Does anything sound different about these two sounds when this clipper is turned on or off? To make sure that you're hearing the unclipped version, you have to give yourself a little headroom downstream of this. So here's the trick in a nutshell. You need to say, I'm looking at this bus, this midline bus, right? What other buses are downstream of me? In other words, on the way up to the master, right? So this bus, the midline bus, feeds into my tonal bus. So if I turn off the clipper on this bus clipper on the tonal bus is going to take over and do the clipping instead. But you want to hear it without the clipping, right? So the first thing you do is walk up the stream and disable that bus clipper. Now it's no longer going to get clipped at this bus either if I turn this one off. Then you keep walking up the stream and say, what does the tonal bus feed into? Which, if you look at my colored lines here, is way over on the right. It's the pre-master bus, right? Tonal and drums feed into my pre-master bus. And we don't care about drums because tonal doesn't go through drums. It goes around drums and sums at the pre-master with drums. So I walk up to the pre-master bus and I just turn off that one temporarily. And then you say, now where does the pre-master bus go? Oh, it goes over to the master. And oops, the master has a bus clipper on it too. Let's turn that one off. So now that these yellow lights are off for the bus clipper on all 3 of these downstream channels, the signal's finally going over to my listen bus, which doesn't have any clippers on it. And it's also turned way, way, way down. This whole, peak here is, see, my peaks are only around -16 on the listen bus because of the way I'm staging everything for YouTube. And because I run through VSX, and any kind of VSX emulation like this has to turn the gain way down to do its magic. And it's got a little visual bug where when you first turn it on, it doesn't look like it's turned down. But if I just play this for a second, and switch over to a different emulation, now the gain reduction knob is showing me what it's really doing. It's turning down the signal by a lot to give it the headroom it needs for over amplifying certain frequencies, like especially on a big set of far field monitors or a big huge club subwoofer array or whatever, right? So it's already turning my whole mix down by quite a bit. And to compensate and make things easy for me to come over here and listen to VXS or not, I've got a rack that's in parallel, and this channel is just a tool device that's dropping the volume roughly by the same amount as VSX does. So if I listen to VSX, it sounds like this. And if I listen to it without VSX, just going straight to my headphones, it's the same volume, same perceived loudness, right? So what I'm getting at here is I didn't turn my actual track fader down. I've got this effective, like, huge 13 dB volume drop just because of compensating for VSX. And so that's very convenient because it means I have tons and tons and tons of headroom here on my listen bus compared to my master. You'll notice the signal is still going, it's probably going over, well, it's not going over 0 yet because I haven't turned off that one clipper, but it's still at 0 on the master. But my listen bus is about 13 dB quieter, and this is what we're listening to, okay, right now. So I have lots of headroom. That's the point. You want to get lots of headroom here. And then you come to the bus you want to audition carefully. We're going to turn off the clipper for a second. Let me show you what changes with all the volumes. Okay, we can see that now the midline is going 2.8 dB over 0. Of course, that's feeding up to the tonal bus, and because its clipper's turned off, it's also 2.8 dB over 0. And then that's feeding all the way over to the pre-master bus where we just turned off its clipper, so it's still 2.8 dB over 0. And if we roll back over to the master, we see the master is 2.8 dB over 0 because we turned off all those downstream clippers, okay? And so now, because we have plenty of headroom on our listen bus, which is still 10 dB under 0, so we're not actually clipping anywhere in our signal path to your headphones or speakers, we're going to hear the original unclipped signal just fine because, again, in a DAW, every track and every bus inside the DAW has massive amounts of headroom above 0. Nothing ever truly clips at 0. These red numbers inside your DAW mean nothing except this one red number on, well, actually, the one number on whichever bus is going out to your speakers, which in this case is my listen bus. You never want that one to be red. You want to make sure this is never red because then your printed copies, your bounces, your resamples, your exported masters, they'll all be hard clipped if this number's ever red. So there's only a few places in your DAW you have to think about and care about a red number, right? So nothing's really clipping here, and so we can hear the original signal without clipping, and we can even see it now. You can see here's the 0 line. And so this peak is clearly going way over 0, and that's one of the things getting clipped. Let's look at it one more time together, now that you kind of know the theory. All right, clipping here, bunch of tiny little clips right here, and so on. So we're in a position now to just turn this one bus clipper, this one clipper on this bus on and off, clip these little extra peaks going over from those two combined sounds, the rolling bass and the piano, and decide for ourselves whether you can hear the clipping at all. My guess is you can't. Let's try it. So we'll start with the original, and when these lights come on and you start seeing the graph, we're seeing the clipped version. And we're just going to go back and forth real quiet. Right? Can you hear any difference? No, no, it's very, very transparent, like most clipping if you don't overdo it. Now, if I had 6 or 7 or 8 sounds summing up to this total bus, or 10 sounds all happening at the same time, all summing together, all layered on top of each other, yeah, that's probably a lot of summing, and I'm probably going to start hearing some clipping. And again, like I said way back in episode 2, one of the advantages of forcing yourself to clip at the buses automatically, to just shave everything at 0 on every single bus, is it lets you know when you've got an arrangement problem, a sequencing problem, a sound choice problem, or a mixing problem. You've made some decisions that ultimately are just adding up to a big problem at some bus. And you can just go through and test your buses easily in this way. Once your project's getting full of stuff and you're just not sure if you're hearing clipping or not every time you do playback and work on it, you can pick any bus you want and isolate it in this way and just listen A/B on and off by turning the bus clipper on and off and maybe looking at the waveform at the same time, and decide for yourself if you're starting to hear clipping from too much buildup at that bus. Now, if you are starting to hear buildup at that bus and you are starting to hear clipping, well, you've chosen a bunch of sounds and they're in an arrangement. And so probably the real problem is with your arrangement at that point, because again, like I said back in episode 2, if you're going to work loud, if you're going to play in the very loud genres, and you have to force your mix into this very tight dynamic range to be able to hit that loudness, it's going to constrain your choices. It's going to limit your choices. And so that nice 3 layers of arpeggio with a backing chord with a big woofy atmospheric low rumble, and then some piercing arpeggio on top of it all happening at the same time on top of each other. Yeah, that may sound great, but it may also mean you can't make that track super loud, or it's going to sound squashed and crappy, because there's just no way to fit all that sound together in one spot at the same time and squeeze its dynamic range more than a certain amount, because to squeeze that dynamic range down means to clip it all more at some bus somewhere along the line, right? So yes, you will run into situations where you go, wow, I thought I was doing really good until I tried to fit this next sound in to this drop section or whatever. And now I'm starting to hear distortion I don't like. I'm starting to hear some clipping I don't like. And you come over and you check out the bus where all those sounds are coming together and you go, yep, there's some clipping when I A/B this on and off. I don't like it. Okay, what are you going to do? You have 2 choices then. Your choices are to turn the track down by using the VCA trick and just go grabbing any VCA button you want that should be sitting in your clipper rack. Now, it's not going to be in a bus clipper, but it'll be in a track clipper somewhere, right? So on my original piano sound, for example, if I go back here, here's one of my grouped and linked VCA knobs. At that point, you could say, well, let me just take everything down 3 dB, make the whole mix 3 dB quieter, and see if I still get clipping that I don't like on this bus point, because it's just going to take everything down across all the source tracks and pull the entire originating set of signals down out of the clipper cascade, just like I showed you back in the episode about the VCA trick here, episode 8, right? If you haven't seen that episode, go watch it. Point is, you have this kind of control, and it's one choice you could make if you decide suddenly a bus is starting to clip and you don't like the way it sounds. It's not transparent. Turn the track down. That's one choice. Okay, you're just not going to be able to make that particular arrangement with those particular sounds you want to use as loud. Don't make a track louder than it wants to be. Don't make a track louder than it can be. That's what's wrong with a lot of the stuff in the loud genres right now, is people are just cramming things into this -7 LUFS range, -6 LUFS range. They're trying to be loud just for the sake of being loud, or they have a legitimate need to be competitively loud, but they're doing it with the wrong sounds and the wrong arrangement, and they're trying to cram a square peg into a round hole, and it doesn't work, and it sounds bad, and it sounds harsh, and it's one of the reasons loud electronic music in particular has a bad rap, because too many people are trying to cram sounds that can't be made loud into a loud mix. Okay, so one choice is turn it all down. The other choice is to leave it where it is and stick with your original vision of, I need to be competitively loud. I need to have a loud hopping banger. But if you discover that you're adding another sound in to a drop, and it's going to happen at the same moment as other sounds, it's going to be layered or overlapping somehow, and now one of your buses is blowing up and you can hear the clipping and it's bad, you don't like it, well, turn it down or change your arrangement. Literally change your sequencing. Get those sounds off of summing up with each other. Move them apart. That's why dance music has the sound it has. Dance music, if you pay attention, doesn't, especially the drops. Now, intros and breakdowns and outros, tons of layered sounds because they're quieter. They're not loud. But those banging drops, listen to what's going on in them. It's one sound after another, sequenced in call and response, interjected glitches that suddenly shut up everything else, and the only thing you hear is that super loud interjected glitch, right? But it's just like loud sound followed by loud sound, followed by loud sound, followed by loud sound. It's not four loud sounds stacked on top of each other in a layer cake, right? That's the sound of electronic dance music, that the heavy, big, heavy drops are just sequenced, they're sliced, they're checkerboarded, they're vertical, right? So this is a wake-up call, right? When you start hearing a bus that you suspect is starting to sound bad because it's clipping too much with all the stuff being fed into it, and you do check it this way by isolating it and A-Bing it on and off, and you go, yep, that sounds bad. Well, you just saved yourself from a train wreck after doing even more work and putting on more signals and building up and spending all this time making agonizing mixing decisions and all this stuff you never would have caught if you were working at the traditional gain staging down at -18, -23, -12 with tons of headroom. Hearing the clipping on the bus has just saved you a ton of surprise and rework by the time you get to the mastering phase. We're kind of just mastering as we go, really. It's mixing and mastering as you go. You find the problems early, you fix the problems early, one way or another. Let's go back to this sound and this person's original question of, should I try to clip a sound like this a little bit to spread that clipping workload out? Okay, let's talk about that now, because this little side trip into testing the bus was one of the answers. One of the simple answers is, if you don't hear a problem at the bus where they're all coming together, don't worry about it. Be lazy, right? That piano sound wasn't hitting zero. The rolling bass is going above zero, and it's already being clipped a little bit. And then they're both being summed together at this midline bus, and it looks like this when it's clipped. But then we tested the clipper on and off. And if you don't hear a problem, why bother fixing it? Be lazy, move on, do something, do the next thing. So my real answer to that question is, if you wonder if you should do something with a quiet mix, a quiet song where the only clipping that's happening is on your buses, and you say, yeah, but would it sound better if I just also forced some clipping onto those early tracks, even though they're not hitting zero or going over zero? The answer is technically yes, it would sound better, but do you need to bother? Is it worth the hassle? Okay. So the first trick is just check that bus. Does the bus sound different if you turn the bus clipper on and off? If it sounds no different to you, then that clipping's incredibly transparent. Don't worry about it. Move on. Do something else. Stay creative. Okay? Now, let's say for whatever reason you're extremely picky and you just can't stand the thought of a piano track that looks like this. And let me turn these clippers back on. So we're going to turn on the, okay, we're on the bus clipper on the midline bus, and that's turned back on. Let me walk upstream and turn these clippers back on at the tonal bus and at the pre-master, and then over here at the master. All right. So we're back to nothing's going over zero, everything's clipping. And let's go back and just solo this piano track to look at it one more time. So here's a potentially high spike here, right? And here's a potentially high spike here. And then this is, a little sharp looking, and maybe these transients don't need to be that sharp. So maybe we could take a dB off and see what it sounds like, right? So yes, you can do this if you want. And yes, it will minimize the potential clipping you're hearing upstream at a bus clipper. And this might be the answer for you loud electronic dance music producers. If you have a drop and you've layered in a bunch of sounds and so far everything's good, but then you decide, I want to add one more sound, and it's going to happen at the same time as all these other sounds, and suddenly that bus is kind of blowing up and you're hearing the clipping. Okay? So this could apply to partway fixing that problem too, if you really wanted to go to this effort. It's not much effort, but it's a little effort. Let me show you how to do it. The idea is let's do a bit of little tiny clips to just clean up the sound a little bit. Let's make sure it's transparent. Don't overclip, just a clip. Make sure you don't hear the clipping. And then maybe that'll fix the upstream problem at some bus, and it'll make it sound acceptable now. I don't mind it, what's happening. So the way you do this, whether you can see it in the middle or whether it's happening over on one of these left or right sides, it doesn't matter. It's happening, and the clipper sees it because the clipper's looking at both of those tracks equally, and it just clips whichever track has a peak that goes over its threshold, right? So we'll leave this in kind of this split view, and we'll come back over here to the clipper that's on this piano track. All you need to do, it's the simplest thing in the world, is look at the signal somewhere that's letting you see the clips and know how much you're clipping it. Like I want to just take that little wonker right there off. Okay, I want to flatten everything off about to here where I'm rolling my cursor back and forth. So you don't do it with the input knob, you do it with the threshold knob. The signal's coming in just like this, but internally you're going to take the clipping threshold down towards, the middle. So you just drag this down. Let's say I want to take everything down by 1 dB. Let's run it and see what happens now. And already we can see that now this is looking a little less caterpillary, but we've still got a few peaks. That one's still poking out a little bit. That one's still poking out a little bit. Let's take it down another dB. Let's go to 2 dB. All right, now see how those are looking obviously a tiny bit clipped now, but it's not too bad. That one's still nice and sharp, even with 2 dB of clipping. Okay, so you can kind of do it visually and just be really gentle visually, or you can do it the way I've taught you, which is to leave this thing at 0, link these two things together and just kind of A/B it at the same volume until you hear the clipping and then pull back. And then you can just translate what you hear here to this number instead. In other words, let's do it. Let's just do it rather than trying to talk you through it. So I'm going to listen this time. I'm going to listen for the point where I start hearing the clipping. Okay, I definitely hear clipping. Just a little bit of gritty clickiness that's too obvious, right? This particular sound is very soft and tonal, Doesn't have a lot of hard transients to hide and mask the clipping when it gets to be too much. But that's 8 dB of clipping. I mean, that's a massive amount of clipping. Let's take it back into this range that's pretty transparent. I'm going to say maybe like 3 dB, 3.5 dB. So let's do our second check, just like I showed you back in episode 6. Now we're just going to A/B it on and off and see if we hear the difference. It's going to be the same loudness either way. So off. On. And if we really want to make it easier to compare, we're just going to play the first few notes over and over. Off. On. Off. On. Can you hear any audible clipping? Do you hear anything that's objectionable there? No, you don't. 3.1 dB is a pretty minor amount of clipping, even though it looks kind of drastic. I mean, that's kind of looking squared off-ish looking, and that's looking squared off-ish looking. But you could probably get away with this much, and in the context of everything else that's going on at the same time, everything else is going to mask that in the full mix, right? So this is that trade-off. It's not perfectly the same, it's not perfectly clean, but it's probably transparent enough, especially if you turn everything else on, like this. Right? Are you going to notice that clipping with all that other stuff going on? Probably not. Okay? So let's say we decided doing it by ear rather than visually. We decided that that was the right amount of early clipping to do on this one piano sound. Okay? Little clips everywhere. Lots of little paper cuts. So we just come in here and type negative 3.1. And now it's the same value we discovered here, right? And then we double click this to set it back to 0 on both the input and the output. And now that clipping is just happening instead of by pushing the signal up into 0, we're just pulling the threshold from 0 down by the same amount to negative 3.1. And there's our clips right there. Okay. So now that you've done this, you can forget about it. All right. You cleaned up this one track a little bit. You took away some really egregious looking skinny caterpillar peaks that you can't hear the difference on or off, whether they're clipped or not. And so, yeah, now 3.1 dB less of peaks are potentially summing with the other sound, with the rolling bass sound here in the drop channel. And so that means this particular midline bus where they're first coming together isn't going to be clipping as much. Yeah, it's better, but it's a lot of work. I mean, you got to come in here and do the measurement, do the thing and set the threshold and whatever. But if you want to do it, by all means. If you want to be really perfectionist, okay, who am I to stop you? But I think you can be lazy by just testing the bus first and saying, do I even hear the clipping? The extra clipping from letting this sound be its gorgeous original self that isn't clipped at all, right? Trade-offs, it's all trade-offs. You're just managing trade-offs. You decide what's important to you. I'm showing you techniques and ways to think about it. Now, you might ask at this point, yes, but what happens now that I've set that threshold? Is this still equally applicable to the VCA trick? Like if I come and pull the VCA down, is that going to pull this sound out of the threshold? And the answer is yes, yes, it will. I could show it to you, but just test it on your own. You'll see the VCA trick works whether you've clipped by pushing the signal above the threshold, but with the input. And it also works if you just pulled the threshold down from 0. Either way, it's just thresholds. And if you actually reduce the gain of the signal in front of the clipper, yes, it will pull those peaks right down out of the threshold, however it got set and however you were pushing above that threshold. Okay, so if this isn't making sense to you, experiment with it, puzzle it out. Eventually, you'll just not even think about this anymore because it's just the easiest thing in the world. It's only difficult at first because we were not used to this kind of thinking. I guess the next question is, we're going to keep this sound where it is because this will feed nicely into the last question, the thing that I know a lot of you have been waiting for. What's the deal with these other clippers that Baffy's had sitting in the rack since forever? Okay. So, yes, the TLDR is on certain types of sounds, on certain types of buses. Sometimes you'll get a slightly cleaner result, a better sounding result, if you use something other than KClip. Or if you tell KClip, you know what, I don't want you to clip this signal with a hard clipping shape. I want you to use a slightly soft clipping shape, right? I want to soften it up. Or maybe I want to oversample it. Maybe I want to come in here and set my oversampling to some value. Or any one of a zillion what ifs, what ifs, what ifs, okay? So let's talk a little bit about that. Here's a general rule of thumb. The more complex the signal you're trying to clip, the more potential that it might sound better with something other than a hard clipper. Another rule of thumb, if the signal you're trying to clip has a lot of lower bass frequencies and sub-frequencies in it, chances are good that something other than a hard clipper will sound a little better, like audibly better. So remember that. More complex, could be better to use something other than a clipper, a hard clipper. And especially if it's more complex in that it includes low bass frequencies and sub-frequencies. So what that means in practice is this. If we look through my busing structure, right, and we look at the drums, I've got kicks, I've got snares, I've got tops. Now, snares and tops don't have a lot of bassy, subby frequencies in them. Maybe a snare, but certainly not top layers, usually. Cymbals, percussive things. Kicks, however, have big, heavy bass waves in them. That's the whole tail of the kick, right? So, on an individual kick, on any one kick, your goal isn't to squish the subby tail much at all. And if you do, you actually probably want that hotter, brighter distortion from a hard clipping to help enhance the transient punch you're taking away by squashing the transient with the clipper. So it kicks in an odd plot twist actually sound best with a hard clipper most of the time. Although, depending, you might want to, on your kick, your original kick sound itself, in the original track clipper for the kick, you might decide as you get into final mixdown to just ask yourself, what does it sound like if I soften up the clipper a little bit? Because the more you soften the clipper, the less audibly it will hit and distort the sine subby waves in a signal. And that means the tail of the kick. So a kick that sounds a little too knocky and thin when it's clipped with a hard clipper might start sounding a little warmer and thicker and rounder on that bottom boom if you soften it up a little bit. Not necessarily all the way, but a little bit. You just roll it and do it by ear. Decide if you like the kick better this way. In fact, let's try it on this kick. I'm going to solo this kick. Let's listen to it in the track. All right, that's what we're starting with. In this particular case, I don't hear a big difference at all. And that's because this kick was designed to be very knocky and short and thin, and so the tail isn't very emphasized in this kick anyway. So in this case, hard clipping is perfectly fine. In fact, it sounds best, right? But if I were to choose a different kick entirely that was warmer and fatter and heavier, yeah, you might dial this in a little bit and go, huh, I actually like it with a little bit of softness on it. And you should go with what you like, right? But here's the point I want to make. Don't start making these advanced decisions about changing your clippers around, softening a clipper, adding oversampling, trying different clippers or limiters. My advice is early in a project, while you're still in the arrangement and composing phase, while you're still in the early mixdown phase. And if you're like me, you kind of munge all that together in one workflow. I mix as I go, not intensively mix. I do simple, basic mixing decisions as I go. And then once my arrangement is done and my song structure is finished, then I spend a lot of time doing really heavy detailing and complex mix decisions and listening close to this and listening close to that and tweaking stereo field and tweaking filters and doing all kinds of stuff to like squeeze out every last bit that I can from the mix. And even at that point, I probably want to keep it on KClip, a plain, simple, hard clipper on KClip, just like it's been. And there's two reasons for that. There's two reasons I strongly recommend you start with a hard clipper and keep it simple. Hard clippers are completely transparent, except for the very instant they take a sample and snap it to the threshold, okay? Your entire waveform underneath the threshold remains completely unchanged. It's only those samples that go above the threshold are instantaneously squished to the threshold, which is 0 in my methodology, right? And so it is the most transparent as a whole to your sounds that you're working with and comparing and contrasting and building up and deciding how to mix and balance and, how should this be leveled into the framework and what kind of EQ should I put on this? You don't want a clipper that is radically changing your sound. That's a later decision. And you don't want to put a limiter on that sound too early either, because limiters are not instantaneous. Okay? A limiter is kind of half compressor and half clipper in the way that it works. It's like a clipper in that the minute it sees a transient, it clamps down on that transient instantly. Okay? That part is very much like a clipper. They're both instantaneous. They see a sample over the threshold, bam, they snap that sample right to the threshold. Almost, instantly in the case of a clipper and nearly instantly in the case of a limiter. It might as well be instantly, even though there might be some look ahead or some lag or who knows. But it's very, very fast on a limiter. So that part, in that way, a limiter is working like a clipper. Instant slam down, instant squash. But where a limiter is very different from a clipper is that after that squash, there's this weird, almost 2 stages of release time where it decides when to let go of the squash and finally release it back to full volume again. And that release itself takes time. There's like 2 stages. Most clippers have like a hold stage where it clipped and it's squashed and it will stay squashed no matter what for a certain short segment of time. Kind of like some settings you do on gates to keep them from releasing too early. In case another peak comes by really quickly, you don't want it constantly squashing and unsquashing and squashing and unsquashing. You kind of want it to hold its squash for a little short amount of time. And that's usually called the attack time in something like Pro L. Let me bring up Pro L so you can see this. It's so confusing because new producers get confused by this all the time. Pro L has this attack setting, right? And you think, well, that's just like the attack on a compressor. It sees a peak above the threshold and it starts to cut down into that peak and carves an envelope, an attack envelope into the signal. But it's not. This has nothing to do with that first peak. The first peak is always instant, and it's kind of really just affected by this look ahead. The peak is instant every time. Both of these settings, the attack and release, have to do with the release envelope once it decides to let go of the signal because the peak is now below the threshold again. So this is more of a hold time. This setting here says, okay, when you clamp down, I want you to stay clamped down for an entire quarter of a second, 275 milliseconds. Don't even think about releasing. Stay squashed. Wherever you squash to the threshold, stay there for a quarter of a second. And then if you're still below if the signal is below the threshold after a quarter of a second, now you can start releasing back to 0. And I want that release to go for 400 milliseconds. And so both of these settings are about the release envelope, and it's really weird and counterintuitive, and it's hard to visualize what it's doing in your brain. It's hard to match it with what you see happening up here. It's just really confusing, and most of the limiters work that way. So limiters work like a clipper on the initial transient squash, but then they work like a compressor on the release, and that release carves an envelope into everything else that's got nothing to do with your peaks that went over 0. Peak goes over 0, it slams down, and then for as much as like, a half a second afterwards, it's carving this slow release envelope back to 0 again. So it's changing your waveform nowhere near the peaks that are actually going over 0. A hard clipper is the most transparent, instantaneous thing possible. And that's why I say start with a hard clipper, because you're doing all this other stuff. You're picking sounds, you're making mixing decisions and EQ decisions and filtering decisions and all sorts of processing decisions. And you don't want to hear the clipper. If you throw a limiter on there at first instead of a clipper, you're going to hear that release envelope from the limiter, and it's going to screw you up because you're not hearing the real signal. Okay? So that's the main reason I say start with a hard clipper and stick with a hard clipper all the way till final mixdown. Just keep it simple. And if you're hearing the clipping from the hard clipper, right, that's a sign that something's wrong with that sound, or something's wrong with your processing on that sound. Maybe it's not the right sound for your track and the small dynamic range you're trying to squeeze it into. Maybe you need to pick a different sound. Or maybe you need to arrange it so it's not summing with other sounds at the same time and getting squashed by a bus clipper, yada, 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 the whole thing I've talked about for close to 20 episodes now, right? This is your friend. A hard clipper is your friend during the early composition, arrangement, sequencing, sound design stages of your project. And it's even your friend during the early mixing stages of your project when you're doing basic mix decisions, basic mix leveling, basic stereo field control, and all kinds of stuff, right? Wait till the very end when you're done with all that stuff and you're just thinking about final dynamics and final cleanup and polish and shine. That's when you say, okay, it's time to decide if I would get a better sounding result by using something other than a simple hard clipper. And the answer is yes, sometimes you will. And that revolves around whether it's a complex signal with a lot of different instruments all interacting in that signal, a lot of different sounds, and especially if some of those sounds have subby or bassy frequencies in them. That's when other options might be better. One of those options is just try softening the hard clipper. That's one option. Another option is try oversampling the clipper. That's another option. And I don't know why that's saying -8. It should be 1, but we won't go there. And then the other option is to try something entirely different than KClip. And so that's when we get into newfangled saturate and track limit. So it's finally time to talk about these, and I'm half afraid to. Track limit's easy. We're going to start with track limit. We're just going to focus on this piano sound because it's a nice, gentle sound. It's kind of warm, so it has some bassy type tones in it. Not too bassy, but it's warm sounding. And so far we've been clipping it with KClip. Let's talk about why you might want to test track limit instead. And for those of you that aren't familiar, if you're a Bitwig person or an Ableton person, this makes perfect sense. This is just a processing rack, and I have 3 different clippers in 3 different channels. This is called an FX selector rack in Bitwig, and if I basically click the button for one of these other things, I'm just choosing which one of these processors I'm actually using. Now, these 2 are also deactivated by default because that way they don't use any system resources. It's like they don't exist. But what I'm going to do is enable these 2 tracks so that I can actually now switch between them. So now they're using up a little more resources in my project, but not much. And I'm going to do this so that I can just A/B test between the 3 of them. Okay? That's the advantage of a rack like this. It's literally just click a button and hear the difference. Now, how they're set up, let me just briefly describe it. KClip, by default, this is why I clip to 0, because then you don't have to worry about anything. Everything's at 0. The threshold's at 0, the ceiling's at 0. Maybe I'm driving the input a little bit, but the output is at 0. And so all it means is if my peaks of my signal push above that ceiling at 0, right, it'll clip. And if the peaks don't come above 0, they aren't clipped, right? And that's why the VCA trick works. That's why everything works, okay? Now, the trick is if you set up a rack like this for yourself, you set your other things up to do exactly the same behavior. So here, newfangled input is at 0. The drive this is effectively the well, oh, I kind of hate talking about saturate. Basically speaking, the way you see it sitting here just like this, it's exactly like KClip. It's going to clip anything that goes over 0, period, done, okay? And so that's how I set up newfangled saturate. And then TrackLimit is a limiter, but it's a very special kind of limiter. It's a wideband limiter. It's the little brother of DMG Audio's big clipper that they call limitless. Okay, this is the big brother of this little clipper right here. This is a multi-band limiter, very fancy, very good limiter. I like it a lot. I use it a lot. I'll talk about it later in my episode about mastering limiters. But the basic idea is this is a scaled down version of it that's just single band. And it has a few of the more useful modes or styles of limiting from Limitless, the big clipper. And you have some very basic controls. You don't have all the big full feature controls. And this was designed to be part of a suite of channel utility plugins. It's meant to be incredibly super lightweight. And that's what I love about it. It is a limiter. It acts like a limiter. It has a release envelope. It has different styles of how quickly it will clamp down on the transient and the shape of the release and how it detects the transient and release. That's what's different about all these algorithms. But it's set up again with its input at 0, its threshold at 0, its ceiling at 0, and the output doesn't even have a control, really. So it's set up just like KClip or Saturate in this rack. It'll clip everything that goes over 0, but it'll clip it in the way a limiter does, which is snap it down and then have a slow 51 millisecond release time. So I'll get into the specific settings of Saturate and TrackLimit in a minute. I just want to demonstrate right now that they're all going to hit the signal that goes over 0, and that allows me to just go bip, 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 and hear how they all 3 sound when they're clipping a given signal, okay? So now, to do this right, I need to push a little higher into these 3 clippers because remember, I was using dP meter to get my peak right at 0. I'm going to force the signal to go above 0 by just putting in another tool. And I'm just going to artificially, remember before we were testing how much could we clip this without hearing it? I'm going to artificially put it up around 3 dot. Now let's give it 4 dBs of clipping just to decide which sounds better. Okay, so I'm artificially pushing the signal 4 dB above 0. So it's going to hit all these clippers and they're going to try and shave 4 dBs off of it somehow using their different sounding processes. And we're going to hear what it sounds like. We're just going to listen. We're also going to take a look at the signal in SciScope, although you probably won't see much difference. And let's solo this track and let's see what happens. I'm just going to start with KClip. We heard that before. And let's do the, so you can see it being clipped. Let's do this big left plus right view again. Okay, here we go. Okay, there's our two clips happening in those first sounds. Let's hear it one more time. Burn it into your brain. Now let's try saturate. Now let's try track limit. Could you hear much difference? Sounded pretty much the same. Now the pictures are telling a slightly different story, ever so slightly different. Focus mostly on this signal on the bottom because this is the one that, for whatever reason, it has more obvious clips in it. Now, track limit is doing the thing a limiter does. I want you to notice that like this thing here is being squared off, this thing's being squared off, this is being squared off, right? This is being squared off just a tiny bit. Watch it one more time. Okay. Now let's compare that with the hard clipper because that'll be the most drastic difference between a pure hard clipper and a limiter that's supposed to be better, right? Does it look better? Does it look fundamentally different? Does it sound any different to you? Let me just go back and forth between these two. I think the easiest way to be an effective producer is to build yourself a rack like this with whatever alternatives to KClip you want. And I will talk in a minute. I'll go into a little more detail about saturate and track limit. But the idea is get them set up to all clip at 0, exactly the same way. If it goes over 0, you're going to do something about those peaks. Put them in a rack that you can easily somehow just toggle ABC, ABC, ABC a couple times on a given sound and ask yourself if you hear a difference. If you don't hear a difference, my advice, stick with the hard clipper. Forget what your brain tells you is theoretically better. Oh, a limiter is always better than a clipper, right? It's more transparent. Everyone says limiters are more transparent than clippers. Yes and no. Yes and no. In some ways, on some signals, like especially on a big, full, complex signal, like an entire mix full of all these different instruments and harmonics and their melodies and their fundamentals interacting and weaving together with a big, low bottom end frequency riding through all that too, from the subs and the kicks and whatever. Okay, yeah, you may hear that track limit sounds better way up on your pre-master or something on your pre-master bus, and we'll test that in a second, right? Theoretically. But on a single individual track of some sort, the original sound like this one, your mileage may vary. A lot of sounds you're not going to hear a difference, or if you hear a difference, it's incredibly subtle. But it's easy to test if you build a rack like this and just go ABC, ABC, ABC a couple times. And if you hear one of these sounding obviously better, sure, why not switch to that? When you're in final processing, final mix down, you've set the audio buffer on your audio interface to a really huge, 1024 or higher. You got all this headroom. Your CPU load is super bogged down and heavy anyway. You don't care about latency because like saturate adds latency. And yeah, by all means, test it. If it sounds better, switch to it and forget about it. And if you're clipping to 0, it's literally just as easy as choosing which one of these you like and then just going on to the next bus or track or project and making the same choice. And then you're done. Okay. Now, I guess before I talk about saturate, let's hear where we might actually truly hear a difference between these clippers. And let me take this tool off so we're not artificially clipping this anymore. Let's go back to our smaller, more compact view that's just the mid bus or the mono signal, because we don't need to see everything. Let's go over here to the pre-master and do the same test on the pre-master. And on my bus clipper, right, here's my bus rack. And in my bus rack, on the pre-master, where all the drums and everything's coming together, sure enough, I got the same three things ready to go. So let's activate this one. Let's activate this one. Now we're ready to just flip between them. So now let's listen to the whole mix and see if we hear a difference on the combined clipping that's happening here at the pre-master. Okay, so here's the original mix you've been hearing all throughout the series so far. Let's hear it with saturate. Let's hear it with track limit. On the surface, they all sound pretty similar, don't they? Limiter versus just a simple hard clipper on a very complex, mix hitting negative 6.3 LUFS there at the pre-master. Holy crap, how is that possible? It's a hard clipper. Well, like I've been telling you for years, clippers are just like limiters. In fact, in some ways, they're more transparent than limiters, as long as you're not hitting them hard. Where you start really hearing the difference between a clipper and a limiter is if you're trying to really do a lot of crunching. Limiters, because of that release curve and some other tricks they use internally, they can, in many cases, put a little bit less of that audible distortion that a clipper puts on it. But we're not taking a big traditional signal done at, negative 18 RMS with huge caterpillar spiky type spines on it where all the peaks are summing up at the downbeats and backbeats and whatever. We're not taking this huge, messy, high crest factor signal and cramming it into these things and asking it to do a ridiculous amount of gain reduction on those big, high peaks. We've been using clip to zero. We've spread all the clipping out across a whole bunch of different tracks and buses. We've made a whole cascade of small little tiny paper cuts along the way. And just like I said back in episode 2, it's better to do lots of little clips than to do one big clip. And so by the time you get up to, higher level buses where the signal's getting more and more complex and there's definitely subby waveforms as part of that signal, if you're not asking either one of those to do very much work, whether it's a clipper or limiter, if they're both doing a tiny amount of work compared to what they might otherwise be doing, they're not going to sound very different. They really aren't. And that's kind of the crazy thing about clip to zero is you'll get to the end and you'll go, wow, it sounds fine with just the clippers. I don't even need a limiter. Although, again, final processing you might do on the pre-master with like final EQ and processes like Gullfoss and maybe a final round of analog style tape saturation if you like that sort of thing. If you're going to do any of that, they're going to add new peaks. And if you're going to add final peaks at the end, okay, you might as well just use a really pro mastering limiter to finally take off those last peaks and do what pro mastering limiters do. And chances are it will sound very good, right? As opposed to doing that final little bit of clipping with a clipper, right? You may hear a slight difference. But the point is, on just these three signals right here, these three options, you don't hear a lot of difference. Let me go back and forth just one by one. Now, there is a difference. It's a very subtle difference. Well, to some of you, maybe not so subtle because you already know where I'm going with this and you know where Clipper's weak points is, right? The difference I want you to listen for is the kick drum itself. That's going to be the most noticeable change among these three options on this particular signal, because the kick drum is the loudest signal in this mix that also has a kind of subby, boomy component in its tail, right? That's thuddy little tail. And you may notice that the KClip version of the final amount of clipping, when we finally take the drum sounds and merge them with the tonal sounds, you might notice that the kick sounds a little bit rounder on the bottom when we use the limiter. Let's just go back and forth between the hard clipper and the limiter and listen specifically to the bottom end of the kick. Right? Sounds just ever so slightly, subtly rounder, a little less squashed on those subby sine tail transients, because it's, again, the way a limiter works, it's cutting this weird release curve that keeps the tail from getting squashed the same way a clipper's going to do. And that, you know, you get to this point, you might go, I prefer track limit on this bus. Great. Put track limit on that bus. Done. Easy. No brainer. So let's talk a little bit about what track limit does and what saturate does that's different from KClip. I'm going to start with track limit because it's way easier. KClip, saturate is just a super weird clipper that's counterintuitive in many ways. Here's the deal with track limit. If you, by default, its release tail is going to be around 200 milliseconds, but that's a long release tail. That's really carving a long change into the signal after the transients that are being squashed. So I've experimented with this a lot, and I looked for the settings that I thought were the most similar to a hard clipper in getting out of the way quickly and not affecting too much of your signal after any given peak that got squashed, but still gave you the benefit of some of what limiters are good at. And for me, I've decided that I like the punchy algorithm with the release time sitting somewhere between 50 and 60 milliseconds. And that has to do kind of with the way kicks work and the way that the tone of the sine, the pitch of the sine wave in the kick works. And just, I don't want to go into the math. Punchy between 50 to 60 milliseconds. Maybe drag this up or down a little bit, right? See if you notice a difference. I usually leave it sitting right around 53, somewhere there. And I like stereo linking at about 70%. I don't want to get into what stereo linking is and what what dual mono compression or dual mono limiting is. Just use these settings, and it's going to be a slightly cleaner clipper than a clipper on certain kinds of complex signals with a lot of sub in them. Okay, that's the way I think of it. And I don't want to go down any more rabbit holes than that about track limit. Now, saturate, oh my gosh, I have a love-hate relationship with newfangled saturate. Saturate's claim to fame is what they call detail preservation. And it revolves around this slider right here that you barely even notice, called detail preservation, and you can toggle it on or off. What it does theoretically is, instead of a perfectly hard flat clip, wherever there's subby, bassier frequencies, this only really works with the subby frequencies, right? If there's an underlying bassy, subby frequency and then higher frequencies on top of it, a normal hard clipper just makes these flat peaks like this. Saturate, because it's a spectral clipper, it's got a whole bunch of, it's broken up into a whole bunch of small FFT bins, and then it's kind of keeping the high and mid frequency detail and layering it back in on top of the clipped flat peak of the lower frequency information. And so it results in peaks that aren't, in clips that aren't completely dead and inert, but are still moving back and forth a little bit. Now, in theory, this is great, right? But one thing you have to remember is this might be great on a small single driver headphone cone or earbud cone, or, little tiny speakers sitting on your desk that have only one driver element in them, or your iPhone. But bigger speaker systems have 2 or 3 different drivers in them, right? A tweeter and a mid-range and sub-cone, like, all those 5-inch and 6-inch near-field monitors sitting on most of our desks. Okay? When you split the signal up like that into low frequencies are done on one cone and higher frequencies are done on a different driver of some sort, this becomes less important again, because there's a crossover that's sending the low frequencies to one driver and the high frequencies to a different driver. So, this is it can sound better, and in theory it's better. In practice, is it always better? Especially if you're doing big, heavy, loud club dance music where all the sub-frequencies are going to go to a big sub-array and they're put through a crossover filter that rounds them out. Even if they're flat, it kind of rounds them out by the time it actually hits those subwoofers. I mean, your mileage may vary, but it still might sound better regardless. The thing is, though, it's a weird clipper. It doesn't work like any other clipper, and it's maddening. I really do have a love-hate relationship with this clipper because it's so awkward to set up in any way other than clip to zero. And it has to do, I got to turn off that OpenGL thing, and this probably isn't even going to render correctly for you because OpenGL visualization is buggy. Let's see. Yeah, you're not showing me the wave shape, are you? I have to close and reopen my project and find all of these instances and set them to not use OpenGL. I still have a little bit of messy thing in my template, so I'm not going to bother trying to show you the really bad visualizations anyway. The thing is, this detail preservation and the whole FFT bin works. Look how when I take detail preservation down, this gain reduction meter goes back to 0. But if I push detail preservation up, I'm not even driving a signal through it. It's already telling me that it's going to do 4 decibels of gain reduction, as well as incur latency in my project. And it gets worse. So it's kind of already acting kind of like a soft clipper. It's going to be affecting things below the actual threshold of the clipper. The next thing that's weird is, where is the threshold setting? Where do I set the threshold on this thing? Well, it doesn't really. The threshold is the level that you push into it. It's hard to describe. It's kind of like if your signal's coming in at 0, then the threshold is 0. If the signal's coming in at -6 peak, well, the threshold's -6 peak. And it's kind of like you have to just take this drive knob and drive internally to actually get signal reduction. And it's the messiest thing to set up in the world. So people that use this tend to use it for the way it sounds. They tend to use it because of this theoretical detail preservation. And they'll just plop it on a track and they'll just crank the drive until they hear clipping, and then they'll pull the drive back. And they just find wherever they like that sound, and they'll play with the hard and soft setting. And it's more of a sound design clipper than really a surgical clipper for dynamic range control. And what's even worse is the drive effects. How can I describe this? The drive actually affects the softness of the knee. If you have a slightly soft knee, the more you drive it, the softer it gets, because it does this weird slope thing that's not like any other clipper. And honestly, I hate this thing. I hate trying to configure this for any purpose other than clip to zero. For clip to zero, it's easy and predictable. 100% hard, 0 drive, 100% detail preservation. Keep it at 0 input. It could be auto or not for the gain because we never mess with the output, so it doesn't matter. And just set it up and forget about it. And as you're going through on a given sound, maybe you'll hear a difference between the way it sounds and the way KClip sounds. Maybe you won't. Now, I have to stress this. This is in the context of surgical dynamic control, which is one way we use clippers. I talked about this in a previous episode. There's a whole nother way we use clippers, which is for colored saturation that you can hear. It's sound design. And for sound design, Saturate is pretty cool because it sounds very different from other soft clippers and even hard clippers out there. It sounds different because of this detail preservation. So don't get me wrong, I'm not really bashing on Saturate as a clipper. I think it's a useful clipper. I sometimes use it in the stage that I call saturating from the bottom that I talked about back here in episode 5. Yes, by all means, try out Newfangled Saturate as a saturator, as a colored soft clipper. By all means, try it that way. It's great sometimes. It's just what the doctor ordered sometimes. But in terms of clip to zero and just keeping our crest factor under control, and it doesn't necessarily add so much that's significantly different from KClip. There's a few cases where my brain theoretically thinks, oh, but I know KClip looks like this, and I know Saturate looks like this, so clearly I should just switch this track over to use Saturate instead, and everything will be fine, right? And the answer is yes, everything will be fine, because it's still going to sound almost exactly the same. And if it sounds a little bit better on a pair of Apple EarPods or a pair of headphones that only use a single driver element, or your iPhone, if it sounds a little better because of this detail preservation and everything's being fed to one driver, and so that driver never stops cold like it does here, but it keeps moving to keep producing your high frequency stuff, well, great. Theoretically, that's better. Why not? But I will tell you, if you switch everything to use Newfangled Saturate instead of KClip, this thing takes some system resources. It adds like, I don't know, 40 milliseconds of latency, and it definitely takes more resources because it's a spectral processor. And so if you've got 50 tracks in your project and you decide because of theoretical, stuff like this, you should make every KClip now be Newfangled Saturate, you're going to bog your project down with a lot of, CPU usage. I'm going to say, especially if you do dance music, this benefit is kind of lost a little bit because these big waves that are getting the detail added back onto them, they get filtered out anyway in a different place and sent to a different kind of driver. So your mileage may vary. You could certainly say, okay, I'll take one track at a time and I'll switch from KClip to Saturate, and then I'll bounce that track to audio, I'll flatten it to audio, and then I'll move on to the next one and the next one and the next one. And that's a valid choice. If you want to make that decision, by all means. But again, I'm lazy. I'll just sit here and A/B them, and if I don't hear a difference on any given bus or track, why add the extra overhead? Why, if I can't hear a difference? If you hear a difference, make that choice. That's your choice to make. So hopefully I've finally answered the question about what these are, when you might want to use them. I've told you a couple other advanced tips and tricks about clipping. And so you could think of this whole episode as being effectively a part 2 to episode 6. I've just extended it with more little details and variations. And thanks for hanging with me, and I'll see you in the next video.